I think as instructors and as educators, we need to start understanding and conveying to our students that humans are a part of biodiversity. Title of my presentation, Biodiversity, Land and Culture, Skills, Education, and Career Paths. Okay, so what I thought I would do is start off with my call to action. I'm hoping today be able to impress upon you is the ability to understand how past experiences and successful adaptations can be used in sustainability or sustainability education. And the next thing is to highlight how anthropological or anthropology skills are also green skills to encourage the inclusion of biodiversity and cultural diversity into sustainability education. And lastly, to encourage the inclusion of ecological anthropologists when forming teams. Okay, so it looks like a lot, but this is what I'm going to try to cover this evening. I'm going to start with theory and methodology to give you a little bit of background as to what I have done in the field. Protected area management and sustainability, again, a little bit of a background. I would like to talk about one particular marginal community and local knowledge in Jordan. And when I say marginal, I don't mean marginalized. I mean those who are on, on the periphery in terms of in remote ecosystems. So that will follow with my lessons from the field, which will translate into, I'm hoping, green skills. And again, we'll return to the call to action and how I am going to link the two, and then possible jobs as in green pathways. Okay, theory and methodology. So as Ophelia said, I am a sociocultural anthropologist. Basically, I'm trying to just understand people. And more specifically, I'm trying to understand how people and their environments affect one another. So how do I do this? Well, I am actually an ethnographer. So that means that I actually go into the community, and as it says here, to understand the people and create a portrait of them in terms of my understandings, going deep into the community. And I, for my master's degree, I spent a month there. For my PhD, I spent a year plus there in the community. And what I'm looking for more specifically is qualitative. I do some quantitative, but it's mostly qualitative, and I'll explain that in a few minutes, where I go deep into the communities that do an interview to interact with as many individuals as I possibly can. And one of the other theoretical premises upon which I've built my research is this idea that there is obviously a very close connection between biodiversity and humans. And in fact, humans are part of biodiversity. And that is part of the foundation, and the lens through which I have analyzed this is sustainability lens in looking at this idea of a local community using their knowledge for them to tell me how, in fact, this has all come to be, and whether it is a sustainability, whether in fact it is sustainable. Oftentimes when I would talk to people in management positions, they would always say that it was a success, everything was a success, but I think you have to talk to the local people. And this is what I think is so important, and I'm hoping that this will come across as an important skill set that can be used in the future. Obviously, I'm looking for that triple bottom line. Okay, so let's move on to a little bit of the background that I investigated, or I looked into before I went off into the field, and that was protected area management. And this was also at the time when sustainability was very new in Jordan. And I think this is very, very telling, and certainly helps me understand the results now all these years later, but I can talk about that as we go along. Okay, so very much protected area management has been a part of my life. My parents we used to live in Ontario, Canada. I was born there, and my parents would drive to California with me in the back seat, I think from the age of about, 8 months. And I have been going to camping and visiting protected areas, national parks, my entire life in the United States, Canada, and elsewhere in the world. And one of the things I learned was that when the Yellowstone was first created, there was this idea that carried on into Jordan actually until the 1990s, where people really here, I can show it here, where humans, people, were not considered to be part of nature. So they were removed. And this has had serious consequences. And those symbiotic relationships that had been established were disturbed. And it's only been more recently that we came to realize that not only was this unethical, but it was seriously harming that particular ecosystem. And as it says here, the effects of these misinformed decisions resonate to this day. A cautionary tale from Yellowstone. There was a book that I read about Yellowstone when it first started. I think it was, I can't remember the title, sorry. I was published in the 1970s. But it talked about the removal of First Nations people from their traditional lands in the Yellowstone area, and how today the ecosystem is still suffering from that. And I thought that was quite spectacular, and that has always stayed with me. Okay, so now we'll go more specifically to what I did in Jordan. And again, this hope of what I'm about to share with you can be used in the classroom and can be used in a maybe a more nuanced way to understand how sustainability or the lack of sustainable development is and climate change is affecting these kinds of communities. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Jordan is over here. I'm actually a little bit further south at the moment, and to the right-hand side, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm over there in the corner there on the other side of Riyadh. And where I did my work is what is called Wadi Rum. Wadi, for those of you who don't know, in Arabic is like a valley. And this is the spectacular landscape of the Wadi Rum, which later became the Wadi Rum Protected Area, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But it's spectacular. It's a sandstone on granite. It is really breathtaking. There are Bedouin families, tribes that have lived in this area for for as far back as anyone could recall. And they all belong, the ones that I was personally involved with, and the ones whose lands are now within the Wadi Rum Protected Area, are part of the Hawatat larger tribe, and they are the families of the Dubur, the Amran, the Zalabia, the Zawaida, Gedman, Swelhin, and Mazana. And for some of you, you might think that Wadi Rum sounds familiar. And this became famous when Lawrence of Arabia wrote his book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, because, in fact, there's a picture of the Seven Pillars of Wisdom during the early 1900s to try to get rid of the Ottomans. In terms of livelihood, they were pastoralists who would take their large herds of sheep, goats, and camels north and bring them back to winter in Wadi Rum. And more specifically, this is where, as I said, I did my master's and my PhD research, where I was looking, as you can see, the intersection between culture, local knowledge, biodiversity, economics, international development, and then the local interpretation of protected area management. And as it says here, these are lessons for the future. But it was a place where, as I had mentioned earlier, protected areas in Jordan up until this time had been very similar to Yellowstone and Banff in Canada, where, the local people had been removed and fences were put up and people were kept out of their traditional rangelands. And this caused a lot of problems in Jordan. So they had to change their way of thinking. And then they became more open and they decided to let the people stay. And the Wadi Rum Protected Area is that first area. At first, it was a national endeavor, and then it became international, as I will explain. And I also wanted to do a deep dive into this idea of biodiversity and cultural diversity, and really understanding how the Bedouin thought about their landscapes, how they thought about the animals they were hunting, and the effects of the climate change. Okay, so as I said, this on the right-hand side, this was the first time that the Wadi Rum Protected Area and Jordan in general had a protected area that allowed people to stay in their homes. And in this case, there was a village, it's called Rum Village, which is in the heart of the Wadi Rum Protected Area. And before that, you can see on the left-hand side, there's an image of a traditional Bedouin tent, which is called Beit Shar, House of Hair. and it was made from the hair of the sheep and the goats and the camels by the women. And there was a little tourism industry taking place here before the Wadi Rum protected area came in. And I will also talk more about that in a moment. But as you can see on the right-hand side, this is the visitor center that I think they were given $2 million from the World Bank to build. First of all, it was the Royal Society for the Conservation of Nature in Jordan, if they were doing what they said they were doing. And I wanted to see how they were maintaining the balance between protecting the biodiversity, allowing the people to maintain their customs and traditions, while providing these new ecotourism related livelihoods. I told you I was an ethnographer, so I went there to conduct an ethnography. I lived with 2 families over the many years that I have been in the area. I conducted participant observation and key informant interviews, which are the keystones of anthropology. I collected local knowledge, and I also collected oral histories, which is where I got a lot of the information about what the past was like. And I went there first in 2001, and I was actually there a year ago, but the research stopped in 2009. So this is part of that participation and key informant interviews, is going into the community and meeting with them and talking about the past and trying to understand changes, if there were any changes, and the impact of those changes, the effects. And this was an interesting photo because the 2 gentlemen on the left actually popped by in the middle of our interview, and they started selling a cannibal to the guy that was sitting beside me. I conducted interviews everywhere and anywhere. I conducted them in the desert. I conducted them in villages, in cinder block homes. I conducted them in little shops. I conducted them with older men, younger men, older women. I didn't conduct interviews with children, but I did conduct interviews with young adults who were involved in the tourism business. Some of the lessons that I learned from these amazing people, and again, I tried to make sure that I not only went to and visited somebody from every tribe, but that I went back multiple times. And I had a little team. I had a Bedouin woman who lived in the neighboring village. Her name is Jawahar. She has become so close to me. We've spent so much time together, and she really helped me out a lot. And then Jamal, and Jamal's right in the middle there, and he's now working for the Ministry of the Environment in Abu Dhabi. And of course, all of the other men that belong to the protected area, they would drive us, and then I would also go visit their families and conduct interviews. And now one of the most important things that came out of all of these discussions over all of these years is that they've been experienced drought conditions since the late 1950s, early 1960s. And it's these drought conditions that have literally created the Wadi Rum protected area. The changing of the environment and the Bedouin culture as a result literally was the catalyst for everything that I'm going to be talking to you about. The men and women both told me that they originally had 40 natural springs that they used to visit. That's why that's there. And now there are only 4. So you can imagine, for a group of people that would migrate from the south, which is where Wadi Rum is, all the way to the north, stopping en route at the different springs, letting their animals graze, fattening them up, and then bringing them down for the winter, what an effect this would have. And as a matter of fact, over years, I think even had maybe 5 years, 6 years later, there were serious consequences, and we'll see them now, the loss of many traditions. All of the men and all of the women told me that the Wadi Rum area once had trees everywhere. And as you can see on the right-hand side, there's very little vegetation cover. And actually what you're looking at was after rain, a little bit of rain that came, and a few little flowers popped up. But in general, the area is extremely dry. As you'll see, they've had to compensate for that. This is an example of what they told me they used to do. The red star at the bottom is Wadi Rum, and then they would work their way north, and then they would just make a beeline back to Wadi Rum for the winter months. So you can imagine if all of a sudden those waters, the springs have dried up, there'd be no reason to move north. So everything pretty much overnight stopped. So that meant there had to be some adaptive strategies implemented. And one of the strategies they told me about was this idea of taking their very large herds. Let's say they had 150 animals, sheep and goats, and then they would sell 10 or 20, and then they would buy feed with that. And then once that feed was gone, then they would sell some more. And you can imagine over time, eventually they would be left with only a few or none. And this is very interesting because there are some older women nowadays that still have a couple of sheep and goats, and they love their animals, and it reminds them of the past, and that's the only reason they have them. Other than that, most people don't have animals. And of course, if you don't have the animals, then you can't make the tents, and you can't make everything that you used to make out of their wool. So that stopped, this lovely, beautiful tent. No longer. Now they're making, if you can see it off to the side, they're buying these little pup tents that are supposedly from Turkey. Then, of course, the idea of villages. They didn't have villages to begin with. And what happened is that King Hussein's brother, Prince Hassan, drilled some wells in the DC area, which is on the other side of Wadi Rum. And that created the village. And this is what the village looked like when I first arrived. And then this is what it looks like now. And of course, with the village, there came schools eventually, came the mosques, came medical clinics. Another thing that might be a little bit surprising for some of you is that this is a tradition that pretty much stopped overnight as well, because once everybody moved into the villages, the children started going to school. At first, it was just the boys, and it was just religious school. Well, they found out when they went to the religious schools that this tradition of tattooing women, young girls, actually they were young girls when they had their faces and arms tattooed, that it was actually forbidden in Islam, and pretty much overnight the practice stopped. So the younger women nowadays, you won't find anyone with a tattoo, and they'll all tell you that their mothers and their grandmothers had done something that they didn't know was wrong. So now they're living in the villages, and the environmental degradation, of course, continued because they were in a smaller place. You know, they weren't able to roam, and the grass wasn't allowed to grow, and animals were overgrazing. And then, of course, in the 1960s was when the first Jeep was brought into the community. And so now everyone has a Jeep or two or three. And of course, there are Jeep tracks everywhere. As I told you, there was some tourism before the Wadi Rum protected area, and a lot of climbers come to this area because supposedly climbing sandstone is very challenging. So a lot of bolts were being left in the rocks. The people were cutting green wood, and there was a lot of hunting that was taking place. And this, in fact, was the impetus for the Wadi Rum protected area, which in 1998 encompassed 720 square kilometers. And with that came a team of men, including biologists, lawyers, etc., and new livelihood strategies. Although they were already in place, some maybe, some Jeeps, some camel tours, modified, and they were improved, and everybody had to follow accepted rules and regulations. And while all this was happening, of course, families were still growing, and they were now moving into villages. More and more people were moving into villages. And as you can see, this lovely father on the left-hand side, I was invited to their winter camp to have a dinner one night, or to have a barbecue. And he was telling me that they continue to teach their children all about the traditions of the past. They teach them about the animals of the past. And I think it was 50 years ago, well, it would be more like 75 years ago now, they saw their last tiger in the area. And the children are learning, of course. Also, they go to school, so they're learning the modern, everyday Jordanian curriculum, in addition to the Bedouin way of life. And you can see the juxtapositioning of the old and the new in the picture up in the upper right-hand corner, with the young girls. On the one hand, they've got this Jeep behind them and all modern camping goods, but then at the same time, they've got this old technology, which is called a seine, S-A-apostrophe-E-N, and sorry for my pronunciation. And that's where the women would put the goat or camel or sheep milk, and then they would shake it and they would make yogurt or butter, or depending on how long they were shaking it for. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can see this is very typical of older women. Even though they were living in villages and close to their sons, they still wanted to live in their Beit Shar. So again, the old in the past is very much there. One thing I wanted to mention is when they started the protected area, they took local people, like they hired them for their management team. They created the rotation for the Jeep tours, for the camel tours. They allowed people to have their own camps, not just the one or two that were there originally. And that meant that all of these stars represent the villages whose traditional lands, the Bedouin traditional lands, are within the protected area. So they're all allowed to go in and utilize their lands. And the only one that's actually in the protected area, as I noted, is the Rum one, which is the one in the middle. Okay, so what I've just explained to you very quickly and very briefly, supported by what the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has said. And I'll read this one quote. People living in marginal lands have long been exposed to many kinds of environmental changes and have developed strategies for coping with these phenomena. And I think this is what the Bedouin explained to me, using their experiences and their knowledge. Okay, so how can we use all of this for our purposes here? And how can we share this kind of knowledge with our students? So again, I'm an anthropologist, and I think that traditional anthropological skills are obviously important skills that can be used as green skills. Because without knowing this skill set and applying it while I was doing my research, I would not have been given that opportunity to learn about the past and to connect the dots, basically, to understand why the protected area came in and what was happening leading up to the protected area, right? And again, I am so appreciative of all the people who have shared their wisdom with me. I can't tell you how honored I am to have been in these tents, to have been in their homes, and for them to provide me with this information. And as it says here, where every voice is important and every opinion is valued. So again, collecting oral histories, putting everything together, recognizing that, your research doesn't start when you walk in. I mean, it started for me when I walked into the protected area for the very first time. But for them, the situation, the drought conditions started so long ago. So I needed that background. And as a matter of fact, I have presented on this in other conferences. The information that they shared with me has not been documented anywhere else. And the drought conditions that they talk about, I think measurements started being taken in the 1980s. So there's nothing for the 50s, the 60s, and even into the 70s. So this is really very, very important. And again, participant observation being a part of every part of their lives, joining in as often as you can, learning about things, understanding things. For example, the gentleman in the middle here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, his tent looks a little bit sad there, but locally he was known as a very rich man because he had over 200 sheep and goats. And I learned after a few years that he has sadly passed away, and that now his wife and his sister look after the goats and sheep. Another thing that I've done while I've been in the field, and I think is important for the green skills, is the ability to do these socioeconomic assessments, or SEIAs. And you can see here how you have to understand the environmental impact in addition to economics, cultural, social impacts as well. And of course, if you're dealing with international developments such as the Wadi Rum Protected Area, you have to understand those implications in addition to the hazard and risk assessments. So for me, I spent most of my time looking at environmental issues, but also employment, education, and income to see if there were any changes. And all of this supports what I found recently in LinkedIn, was this article by Carmen L. about bridging worlds, bringing ecology and biology together and using anthropological skills. And if I'm just going to read here, the integration of anthropology into these sciences can bring fresh perspectives, nuanced insights, and a deeper understanding of the complex interactions between humans and their environment. Maybe it's new not for me, but maybe for some of you, this is a new way of thinking about biodiversity and cultural diversity. She also suggested these various areas, such as cultural ecology, a multidimensional view, community-based conservation and collaborative research, qualitative research in field studies, cross-cultural communication in global conservation, behavioral ecology, understanding human-nature interaction. Okay, so we're coming down to the end here. So how can this resource be incorporated in today's sustainability education? So I was thinking about social studies, history, biology, even anthropology, because not all anthropologists study this, sociology, geography, human geography. So this question I'm throwing out to you. Okay, so my suggestions for addressing my call to action. Okay, I think as instructors, as educators, we need to start understanding and conveying to our students that humans are a part of biodiversity. There shouldn't be this separation, and that we learn from our past and we learn from those groups that have experienced other things, who have been on the margins, such as the Bedouin of Wadi Rum, and that we have to link the biological and the cultural diversity and create maybe new definitions, as it says here, so that not only our students, but also children of the Bedouin families I've met have a future. And as it says here, I found another article. It said the global importance of indigenous and local communities managed lands, building a case for stewardship schemes so that they have a job and that they can continue working not only at the Wadi Rum protected area, but also taking care of lands and property. I think we need to rethink Brundtland as well. I think it's just very narrowly defined, and I think we have to include these mixed knowledge systems and quit prioritizing some knowledge systems while excluding others. I think this is the key to the success of the Bedouin, is this idea that they were so insightful in terms of their adaptation and adaptive strategies. This is an article I found from the IUCN. It says, improving and applying knowledge on the constraints and opportunities for enhancing adaptive capacity is necessary to reduce vulnerabilities associated with climate change. And that certainly was the case in terms of Wadi Rum. My last section here was about green employment, because I decided to grab a few job postings from the internet. And I also was trying to think of some ideas that we could talk about here in terms of jobs. So obviously the first one for me would be an anthropologist or environmental anthropologist. Teaching in universities, you could teach in high school, you could share your knowledge. The other one is to be an environmental specialist. And so we're not just talking about the environmental specialist in the traditional way where we're just collecting specimens, but we're also, as it says here, additional duties include monitoring the human impact on the environment and making recommendations to protect the earth. These are some of the places someone like me could get a job. If I wasn't working at PMU in Saudi Arabia, I might consider working for an NGO. I have done projects for the Ministry of the Environment in Oman. How about the IUCN, the World Bank, UNESCO, UNDP, UNEP, consulting firms, research organizations, and of course, universities, as I already said. Here's another job that popped out. It was a UNEP job. It is a conservation effectiveness management manager, various locations, using the skill set that I just highlighted above. An ethno-scientist, of course, this is from the, as it says here at the bottom, from the perspective of one or more culture groups, where you're looking at biology, archaeology, all kinds of things. Of course, you could be a protected area manager. You could be a traditional knowledge specialist. This was another IUCN job. And lastly, you could be involved in tourism, sustainable tourism, and you could do all kinds of things from various perspectives, whether it be accommodations or experience. You could be the owner of a hotel, an owner of a camp. You could be a travel agent, an operator, a guide, such as in Wadi Rum, there are jeep guides, there are camel guides, there are walking guides. There are camps again, and as I mentioned already, the hotel. Okay, so now we're here at the very end, just wrapping up, and hopefully I was able to impress upon you the possibility of including anthropological, let's call it green knowledge. We talked about theory and methodology, protected area management, sustainability, marginal communities, Wadi Rum in particular, the lessons that I learned, the skills that I think we can take from this kind of research, and how we can apply that to my call to action and also possible jobs. Finished, and I would like to say thank you very much to Julian and her incredible team, and to all of you for putting up with me for about the last, 40 minutes. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. It was so very narrowly defined. And I think that narrow definition has contributed to the unsustainability that we have experienced up until this time. And I think if it had been more precise and had included maybe local knowledge and just included more and was more specific, I think then there wouldn't be so much room for personal interpretation, which is what I have seen, especially in this part of the world. I should tell you one thing. So when I was in Wadi Rum in November 2022, so I was very surprised and very saddened to see Rum Village in the center of the protected area in such a deplorable state. I want to go back and I want to talk to the locals. I talked to a couple when I was there, but I was only there for a couple of days. I'd like to go back and do some like extended research. But the protected area itself, all of the landscape is well taken care of. But what's happened in the village with the Bedouin families, there's graffiti all over the walls, and these walls were paid for by the World Bank monies, and it was a beautiful little village. But I knew at the time when I was doing my research that these walls and the configuration of certain, new additions, they weren't, the Bedouin weren't included in the decision making. So I'm wondering if what I saw a year and a bit ago is because of not letting them be part of the decision making, because they were, part of the mandate was to create this lovely village with these beautiful walls. And what I saw is that a lot of the walls were being, they were cutting out holes. And then this is where they were dumping the goat and sheep feces, the manure out that little hole. And they were also adding to the top of the walls with these ugly cinder blocks because, the locals don't want anyone to be looking at their girls. So they want the walls high enough so that the girls can't be seen from the guys that are driving by in their vehicles. So that also wasn't a consideration. Just off the top of my head, when the RSCN went in to create the Wadi Rum protected area, they did so from the perspective of doing all kinds of biological surveys and, trying to figure out what wildlife was there and what was happening with the mountains and the vegetation and all of these things. And they did a socioeconomic survey, which is what I updated it. But I think there's still a tendency to lean in the direction of the biodiversity minus humans.